If your father served in World War II, or your grandfather, or an uncle you barely remember, there is a chance he came home alive because of a man he had never heard of. A man who died 43 years before Pearl Harbor, a man who never fired a rifle in his life, a man who spent most of his career fighting with government clerks and iron merchants in Victorian London, and who once nearly burned his own workshop to the ground. His name was Henry Bessemer, and what he did in a burning workshop in the summer of 1855 decided who won the war your family fought in 90 years later. This is the story of how a single mechanical idea, born in an accident, quietly built the industrial machine that fed the American army, armed the Soviet Union, and in the end ground the Third Reich into dust. It is a story with heroes and villains, with forgotten men and rich men, with slave laborers dying in factories and admirals warning empires that would not listen. It is a story about steel, and it begins on a night in March 1943 over a river valley in western Germany. The night sky over Essen turned white before it turned red. It was March 5th, 1943, a little after 9 in the evening. 442 Royal Air Force bombers droned across the Dutch coast in a long black stream, their engines making the low throbbing sound that Ruhr Valley civilians had learned to fear more than anything else in the world. Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, Wellingtons, 23 of them would not come back that night. Their crews would go down in flames over Holland and Germany, boys of 19 and 20 burning alive at 10,000 feet. But right now, at this exact moment, the target was still ahead of them, and the target was one thing. One specific place, a cluster of factories on the western edge of a German city, buildings that had been forging weapons for over 100 years. The Krupp works, the place the Germans themselves called Waffenschmiede des Deutschen Reiches, the weapons forge of the Reich. When the bombs fell, they fell for 40 minutes. High explosive first, to blow the roofs off and expose the guts of the buildings, then incendiaries, thousands of them, small tubes of magnesium that hit the ground already burning. Fires jumped from workshop to workshop, from foundry to foundry. Reconnaissance photographs taken the next day showed 160 acres of destruction inside the Krupp complex. 53 separate buildings hit, sheets of twisted steel and melted furnaces, workers dead in the streets, and above it all a column of smoke rising 2 miles into the German sky. This was the opening night of what the British called the Battle of the Ruhr. It would last 5 months. It would kill thousands, it would consume 900 aircraft and 6,000 aircrew, and behind it, driving every ton of bombs and every mile of flight, was one obsession. If you could destroy the steel, you could destroy the war. But here is the question nobody asked on that night in March 1943. Why did the entire war orbit around a few dozen factories in a German river valley? Why did the fate of hundreds of millions of people rest on how much of one particular substance a country could pour out of a furnace in a given month? Why was steel, of all things, the thing that decided everything? The answer to that question does not begin in 1943. It does not begin in 1939. It does not even begin in the 20th century. It begins in a small workshop in London on a summer afternoon 87 years earlier. It begins with a man who nearly burned his own building to the ground, and it begins with a mistake that most people then and now would not even recognize as a mistake. His name was Henry Bessemer. He was born on January 19, 1813, in a village called Charlton in the county of Hertfordshire, north of London. His father, Anthony Bessemer, was an engineer and inventor who had spent years working at the Paris Mint before the French Revolution nearly killed him. Anthony had been elected into the French Academy of Sciences for his work on typesetting devices and microscopes. He had worked alongside the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, the man now called the father of modern chemistry. And when the revolution came, Anthony escaped. Lavoisier did not. Lavoisier was guillotined on the 8th of May, 1794. Anthony Bessemer fled back to England with almost nothing. He settled in the Hertfordshire countryside. He built a small type foundry, casting the metal letters that printing presses used. It was here, in this modest rural workshop, that his son Henry grew up. Henry Bessemer never went to university. He never attended engineering school. He had no formal education past the basics. What he had instead was his father's workshop, and inside that workshop he had unlimited access to tools, to metals, to furnaces, and to the slow accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to bend materials to his will. Anthony had discovered that if he added tiny amounts of certain other metals to the molten lead he used for his typefaces, the letters lasted longer under the pounding of the printing press. It was practical metallurgy, learned by trial and by burned fingers and by ruined batches, and young Henry absorbed all of it. By the time he was a teenager, he could work metal in ways that most trained engineers could not. He could read the color of hot iron and tell you its temperature within 50 degrees. He could look at a broken machine and tell you which alloy had failed and why. At 17, the family moved to London and everything began to accelerate. Bessemer's first real invention came from anger. The British government used revenue stamps to mark official documents, and those stamps were embarrassingly easy for forgers to copy. Bessemer designed a machine that pressed the stamp directly into the fibers of the paper, making forgery almost impossible. He estimated it would save the British Treasury the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds every single year. It worked beautifully. The Revenue Office adopted it, and then they refused to pay him a single pound for it. They simply took the invention, used it for decades, and gave the inventor nothing. That betrayal shaped him for the rest of his life. He learned one lesson, and he learned it hard. Never tell anyone what you have built until you own the patent. His next invention made him rich. Around 1840, a printer friend named Thomas de la Rue suggested that Bessemer look into gold-colored paint. At the time, the fine bronze powder that mimicked real gold was produced by hand in Nuremberg, Germany, and it was expensive. It sold for something like £5 per pound weight, which in the mid-19th century was a small fortune for a small tin of powder. Bessemer figured out how to mechanize the entire process. He designed 6 steam-powered machines that could produce the powder at roughly 1/40th the cost of the German method. And this time he did not tell anyone. He built his factory in secret. Only a handful of trusted family members were allowed inside. No visitors, no outside employees, no lawyers, no journalists. His brothers-in-law ran the machines. His sisters kept the books. The building itself was disguised. And the machines ran behind locked doors for decades, and the money poured in. It gave Bessemer something almost no inventor in history had possessed. Complete financial independence. He did not need investors. He did not need partners. He answered to nobody. So here was a man in his early 40s with no formal training, a private fortune built on fake gold paint, and over 100 patents to his name. He had invented sugarcane processing equipment. He had invented improved pencils. He had invented plate glass machinery. He was restless and prolific and rich, and then, in 1853, a war on the other side of Europe pointed him toward the invention that would change the shape of the world. The Crimean War broke out that year. Britain and France went to war against Russia over control of the eastern Mediterranean. And the battlefield revealed something humiliating about the state of European military technology. The cannons were terrible. Cast iron gun barrels cracked and sometimes exploded, killing the men who fired them. Round cannonballs tumbled through the air with no spin, missing targets by wide margins. The whole science of artillery had barely advanced in 100 years. British newspapers ran editorials demanding better guns. British officers wrote furious letters home about weapons that killed their own gun crews as often as they killed the enemy. Bessemer saw the opportunity. He designed a new kind of artillery shell, elongated instead of round, with spiral grooves cut into its side. The grooves would catch the gases from the gunpowder charge and make the shell spin as it flew, dramatically improving both range and accuracy. It was a real leap forward. He brought the design to Emperor Napoleon III in Paris for a demonstration. The emperor was interested. The commander running the tests was not. The commander pointed out something Bessemer had not considered. A heavier, faster spinning shell would generate far more force inside the barrel than a standard round shot. And the cast iron cannons of the day could not handle it. The barrels would crack, the barrels would shatter. The barrels would kill their own crews. Bessemer's shells were, quite literally, too powerful for the guns that were supposed to fire them. That single rejection redirected the entire course of his life. He went back to London with a question buried deep in his mind. If the world needed better guns, the world needed better metal, and the metal it needed was steel. In 1853, steel was almost a luxury. The best steel in Europe was made using expensive Swedish bar iron as raw material. The refining process took roughly 10 days per batch and produced only about 50 pounds of finished steel at a time. It was hand-worked, hammer-forged, tempered in oil or water, and inspected by craftsmen whose skill was passed from father to son. Steel was fine for knives, for springs, for watch parts, for surgical instruments, but at a price of £50 per ton, using it for cannons or ships or railroads or buildings was out of the question. Bessemer decided to change that. He spent the next 2 years locked in his London workshop, burning through his own money, running experiments that seemed to make no sense to anyone watching. The standard method for refining pig iron at the time was called puddling. It involved stirring the molten metal by hand while gradually raising the temperature to burn off impurities. It was slow, it was brutal for the workers, who often died young from the heat and the fumes, and the results were inconsistent from batch to batch, sometimes from hour to hour. Bessemer had a different idea, and it sounded, on the face of it, like madness. What if you did not try to heat the iron more from the outside? What if, instead, you blew cold air directly through the molten metal from below? His workers thought he had lost his mind. Cold air through hot iron, the air would cool the metal, the iron would solidify, the furnace would be ruined. Everyone knew this. It was obvious. One of the workers reportedly muttered that the boss had finally taken leave of his senses. Bessemer told them to do it anyway. The moment the air blast hit the molten pig iron, something began to happen that no one in that workshop fully understood at the time. The oxygen in the air did not cool the metal. It reacted with the carbon and the silicon dissolved in the iron. And that reaction was exothermic. It generated its own heat. The temperature inside the vessel did not drop, it surged upward. For about 10 minutes, everything looked almost normal. Small sparks drifted up through the mouth of the converter, the kind of thing you might expect from any furnace operation. The workers relaxed slightly, then the silicon burned off, then the oxygen hit the carbon, and the workshop erupted. A column of white flame shot straight up towards the ceiling. Molten slag exploded outward in every direction, spraying red-hot droplets across the workshop floor. The zinc panels of the roof caught fire. Nobody could get close enough to shut off the air blast. Bessemer himself, standing back from the machine, watched as his converter turned into what he would later call a volcano in a state of active eruption. 10 minutes. It lasted about 10 minutes. When it finally died down, the smoke cleared, and Bessemer walked cautiously across the wrecked floor of his workshop to look inside the converter. What he saw at the bottom was steel, or something very close to it, purified iron produced in minutes instead of days, using cheap pig iron instead of expensive Swedish bar. And using no fuel beyond the initial melt. The chemical reaction had done all the work by itself. It was, in the language of engineering, almost too good to be true. He spent the next several months refining the process, building larger converters, adjusting angles, testing variations in air pressure and duration. And by the summer of 1856 he was ready to tell the world what he had done. On the 24th of August 1856, Henry Bessemer stood in front of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, meeting that year in the town of Cheltenham. His paper carried a title that made grown men sit up in their chairs: The Manufacture of Malleable Iron and Steel Without Fuel. The room was packed with iron masters and metallurgists, men who had spent their entire careers working with molten iron, men who understood exactly what he was claiming. A process that could turn cheap pig iron into high-quality steel in a matter of minutes, with the impurities themselves providing all the necessary heat. If it was true, it would collapse the price of steel. It would change every industry that used metal. It would rewrite the century. The London Times printed the paper in full the following week. Iron industry journals reprinted it across Europe and America. Bessemer's name became, almost overnight, the most talked-about name in metallurgy. Within days, 5 iron firms across Britain applied for licenses to the new process. They paid up front. They agreed to a royalty of 25 pence per ton of steel produced. Bessemer had made his fortune already from the bronze powder. Now he was about to make history, and then, over the following weeks, every single one of those 5 firms tried to run the Bessemer process at their own works. Every single one of them failed. The steel they produced was brittle. It crumbled in the hand. It was worse than useless for anything structural. These were experienced men who had been running iron works for decades, and they had followed Bessemer's written instructions to the letter. They had built converters to his specifications. They had blown the air at the right pressures for the right times. And what came out at the bottom was garbage. They were furious. Some accused Bessemer of outright fraud. Others accused him of deliberately withholding a critical step to protect his own business. The license fees were demanded back. The technical journals turned savage. Papers that had praised him in September were denouncing him by December. His name became a punchline in metallurgical circles. Cartoons appeared in trade publications showing him standing on a soapbox selling snake oil to gullible ironmasters. Bessemer himself later admitted, in the calm distance of old age, that he probably should have kept the process secret until it was fully reliable before announcing it. What he did not realize at the time, and what would take frustrating months of investigation to figure out, was that he had gotten lucky. Extraordinarily lucky. The iron ore he had been using in his own workshop experiments happened to come from sources that were unusually pure. Naturally low in one particular contaminant. The iron ore available almost everywhere else in Britain and across most of continental Europe was loaded with that same contaminant. And his process had absolutely no way to remove it. The contaminant was phosphorus, and phosphorus made steel brittle. It did not matter how perfectly the rest of the conversion went. If the raw material had phosphorus in it, the finished product would crumble. The ironmasters had not done anything wrong. They had followed the process exactly. Their raw material was simply different from Bessemer's, and that difference was completely invisible until the moment the finished steel cracked apart in your hands. For months it looked like the entire Bessemer process was going to collapse into humiliation, and it might have, except for one man who almost nobody has ever heard of. His name was Robert Forrester Mouchette. He was a metallurgist from a family of metallurgists. His father David had been a well-known contributor to the science of iron. Robert had grown up in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, surrounded by furnaces and foundries. He was 44 years old in 1855. He preferred the quiet of his home in a village called Colford to the noise of London or Sheffield, and he had spent years running thousands of quiet experiments with iron alloys, publishing his findings in trade journals that almost nobody outside the industry ever read. Where Bessemer was a showman who stood on stages and made bold announcements, Mouchette was the opposite, a recluse, a man who worked mostly through letters. He wore old clothes, he rarely travelled, but he understood the chemistry of iron making at a depth that Bessemer, for all his mechanical genius, simply did not. When samples of failed Bessemer steel started circulating through the iron trade, brought to his door by desperate iron works managers, Mouchette recognized the problem almost immediately. And he proposed a solution that was elegant. Do not try to stop the air blast at exactly the right moment. Let the process strip everything out of the iron, every trace of carbon, every impurity, blow it all away. Then, after the air blast stopped, add back a precise quantity of an alloy called spiegelisen. Spiegelisen was a compound of iron, manganese, and a carefully measured amount of carbon. The manganese would neutralize the remaining sulfur. The carbon would restore the steel to exactly the composition you wanted. It turned an unpredictable guessing game into a repeatable industrial process. It was the missing piece. Without it, the Bessemer converter would have remained a curiosity in a museum somewhere. With it, the machine could reshape civilization. Bessemer adopted Mouchette's fix. He used it in every converter he built for the rest of his life, and he never quite admitted in public how essential it had been. Mouchette spent years trying to secure the credit and the money he was owed. He was not good at business. He was not good at self-promotion. His own patents lapsed because he could not pay the fees to keep them active. His health began to fail. His eyesight, damaged by years of staring into furnaces, began to fade. Bessemer eventually agreed to pay him an annual pension of £300, though whether that was genuine acknowledgement or simply a move to avoid a messy lawsuit is something historians still argue about. Robert Mouchet died in 1891. He died poor. He died largely forgotten by the industry his chemistry had saved, and the man who built his fortune on Mouchet's fix went on to be knighted by Queen Victoria and buried with honours. There was also a third man in this story, and he lived on the other side of the Atlantic. His name was William Kelly. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1811. He was an American ironmaster working in Kentucky, running a small forge called the Suwannee Iron Works. And he had independently discovered, sometime around 1847, that blowing an air blast through molten pig iron would decarbonize the metal. He had been experimenting with the process for nearly a decade before Bessemer ever heard of it. His neighbors thought he was insane. His own workers walked off the job when he tried to demonstrate what he was doing. His wife family thought he was going to ruin them. He filed for a patent in 1857 and won a priority ruling from the United States Patent Office that effectively nullified Bessemer's American patent. But Kelly, unlike Bessemer, had no fortune from gold paint. He had no financial cushion. And when the Panic of 1857 hit the American economy, his business collapsed. Bankruptcy forced him to sell his patent rights for a fraction of what they would eventually be worth. He died in 1888, quietly, in a country that would eventually make hundreds of billions of dollars from the exact process he had discovered. 3 men, 3 inventors, one who kept the fame, one who died forgotten, one who died broke. By 1859, Bessemer had given up trying to license his process to other firms. He simply went to Sheffield, the ancient steel-making capital of England, and built his own factory. He sourced iron ore from Cumberland, where the phosphorus levels were low. He used Mouchet's Spiegeleisen chemistry. He tuned his converters until they ran clean and reliable, and within a few years he was producing steel that was cheaper, faster, and better than anything the traditional steelmakers could match. The price of steel in Britain, which had been around £50 per tonne before his process, began to fall. It fell to £40, then to 30, then to 20, then to 12, then to 7, then to 6. Steel had been a luxury material for 1,000 years. In the space of a single generation it became a raw commodity. Something you could afford to lay across an entire continent. Something you could afford to build a city out of. Something you could afford to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And on the other side of the world, in a small industrial town in western Germany, a family that had been casting steel since 1811 was watching all of this very carefully. Their name was Krupp. An ocean away from Sheffield, in the coal-blackened town of Braddock, Pennsylvania, a short silver Scotsman was watching the price of steel fall and doing arithmetic in his head. His name was Andrew Carnegie. He was 40 years old in the year 1875. He had come to America as a boy of 12, a poor immigrant from a Scottish weaving town called Dunfermline. He had started work as a bobbin boy in a Pittsburgh cotton mill at a wage of $1.20 a week. From there he had climbed telegraph messenger, telegraph operator, personal assistant to the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, superintendent himself at the age of 24 of the Pittsburgh division of the same railroad. And by the time the Civil War ended, Carnegie had learned 2 things that would define the rest of his life. He had learned that railroads ran on iron, and he had learned that iron rails, under the weight of modern trains, wore out in 2 or 3 years. Steel rails would last 15, maybe 20. The arithmetic was not complicated. Whoever could produce steel cheaply and in bulk was going to become the richest man in America. In 1872, Carnegie sailed to England. He went to see the Bessemer converters running in Sheffield with his own eyes. He walked through the mills. He watched the molten iron erupt in geysers of white flame. He asked questions. He took notes. He wrote back to his partners in Pittsburgh that the future of steel was here, in these pear-shaped vessels, and that any American company that failed to adopt them would be crushed inside of a decade. And when he sailed home to Pittsburgh, he began building. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works opened at Braddock, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1875. Carnegie named it after his old mentor at the railroad, the man who had first noticed him as a young telegraph operator and pulled him up the ladder. The plant was built on the site of the old Braddock's Field, where a British general named Edward Braddock had been killed by French and Indian forces in 1755, over 100 years earlier. There was something fitting about that. A battlefield of the old world turned into a factory of the new one. Bessemer converters sat at the center of the operation. Great vessels lined with fire brick, mounted on axles so they could be tipped forward to pour their contents. Cold air roared up through the bottom. Molten iron erupted in fountains of flame that witnesses described in colors they had never seen before. A reporter from McClure's magazine, standing on the factory floor years later, wrote about saffron and sapphire flames streaked with deep yellow and violet shadows falling across the men who worked below. The men who worked below did not have it easy. 12-hour shifts, 6-day weeks, temperatures near the converters that could kill an unprepared worker in minutes. Wages that stayed low no matter how much money the mill was making. Men lost hands to the rolling mills. Men lost legs to the ingot cars. Men lost their lives, sometimes several in a single week, to the molten metal itself. And nobody outside the plant much noticed, because the men who died were mostly Irish, mostly Slavic, mostly poor immigrants who had no political voice. And in 1892, at Carnegie's Homestead plant a few miles away, a strike over pay cuts turned into a gun battle between steelworkers and hired Pinkerton detectives. 7 strikers and 3 Pinkertons died. The Pennsylvania State Militia was called in to break the union. The union was broken. Carnegie was in Scotland at the time, fishing at his estate, and he let his partner Henry Clay Frick handle the killing. He wrote a letter afterward saying he was distressed by the loss of life. It changed nothing, but the steel kept flowing. The price of steel in the United States, which had been over $100 per ton in 1873, was cut in half within 2 years of Edgar Thomson opening. By 1890, it was down to $18. Carnegie obsessed over every step of the process. He bought the iron ore mines in the Mesabi Range in Minnesota. He bought the coal fields in Pennsylvania. He bought his own railroad, the Bessemer and Lake Erie, to carry the raw materials to Pittsburgh. He bought the ships that hauled ore across Lake Superior. Every link in the chain was his, and at every step the Bessemer converter sat at the heart of it, doing in 30 minutes what the old puddling process had taken 10 days to accomplish. You could see the result of it if you knew where to look. In 1874, the Eads Bridge opened across the Mississippi River at St. Louis. It was the first major bridge in America to use steel arches. The engineer, James Eads, specified Carnegie steel for the structure, and the decision was considered reckless at the time. Nobody had ever built anything that large out of steel. On opening day, Eads walked an elephant across it, because the popular belief was that an elephant would never cross an unsafe bridge. The elephant walked across, the bridge held, it still stands today. It carries trains and cars across the same river it spanned 150 years ago. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened in New York. Steel cables, steel components. For 20 years it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It connected 2 cities. It became a symbol of American ambition. Carnegie steel ran through its bones. In 1885 in Chicago, an architect named William LeBaron Jenney built the Home Insurance Building. 10 stories tall, a steel skeleton on the inside carrying the weight instead of thick masonry walls on the outside. It is often called the first skyscraper. Without cheap Bessemer steel, that building does not exist. Without that building, the modern skyline of every city on Earth does not exist. Total steel production in the United States went from 157,000 tons in 1870 to 26 million tons by 1910. That is not a gradual increase. That is 160 times more steel in 40 years. And across the Atlantic, in a German town called Essen, another family was building an empire of its own. The Krupp family had been casting steel in Essen since 1811. Friedrich Krupp had founded a small cast steel factory that year, and it had struggled for decades. When Friedrich died in 1826, his 14-year-old son Alfred took over. Alfred Krupp lived until 1887, and he was in many ways the German mirror of Andrew Carnegie. He built, he integrated, he expanded. By the time of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Krupp cannons were mowing down French infantry across the fields of Sedan. When the war ended and the German Empire was declared at Versailles in January 1871, Krupp guns had helped write the founding paperwork in blood. By 1912, the Kruppwerke covered 5 square kilometers of Essen, blast furnaces, rolling mills, forges, machine shops, testing ranges, worker housing, hospitals, schools. The Germans called it the Waffenschmied des Deutschen Reiches, the weapons forge of the German Reich. In the First World War, the massive Krupp siege gun known as Big Bertha shattered Belgian forts that had been considered impregnable. It fired a shell so heavy that the ground trembled for miles around when it landed. By 1918, the firm employed nearly 200,000 workers. Then Germany lost the war, and the Treaty of Versailles ordered Krupp to stop making weapons. They did not stop making weapons. Not really. They pretended to. They officially converted their factories to agricultural machinery, farm tractors, threshers, milk cans, but quietly behind the scenes, engineers kept working on artillery designs, kept working on tank prototypes, kept the institutional knowledge alive. They opened design offices in the Netherlands and Sweden, in countries where German rearmament was not being watched. Waiting. Meanwhile, in London in the year 1878, one more piece of the story was falling into place, and the man who put it there was almost as unlikely as Bessemer himself. His name was Sidney Gilchrist Thomas. He was 28 years old that year. He worked as a clerk in a London police court, taking down the statements of drunks and thieves and unlucky men who had crossed the wrong constable. He had wanted to study medicine as a young man, but his father had died, and Sidney had been forced to take a paying job to support his family. In the evenings, after work, he studied chemistry at Birkbeck College. He was quiet, serious, modest to a fault, and he had become obsessed with a problem that nobody had solved. The Bessemer process could still not handle phosphorus in the iron ore. That single limitation meant that Bessemer steel could only be made from a small number of ore deposits around the world. Most of the iron ore in continental Europe, particularly in the vast basin along the border of France and Germany known as Lorraine, was loaded with phosphorus and therefore useless for Bessemer production. There were said to be billions of tons of iron ore in Lorraine, enough to arm an empire, and nobody could touch it. Thomas worked on the problem in his off hours in a small home laboratory for years. His cousin Percy Gilchrist was a chemist at an iron works in South Wales, and the two of them corresponded constantly, exchanging sample chemistries and hand-drawn diagrams by post. And in 1878, Sidney Gilchrist Thomas figured it out. The answer was in the lining of the converter itself. Instead of using the standard acidic lining made from silica, Thomas designed a basic lining made from burned dolomite or limestone. The basic lining chemically reacted with the phosphorus in the molten iron and pulled it out as slag. The steel came out clean. It was one of the most consequential metallurgical discoveries of the 19th century, and it opened a door that would change European history in ways nobody at the time could have predicted. The mines of Lorraine, which had been useless for Bessemer steel, suddenly became one of the richest iron ore reserves on the planet. Whoever controlled Lorraine controlled the raw material for a continental industrial superpower. France had lost Alsace and part of Lorraine to Germany after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. France wanted it back. Germany refused to give it back, and underneath the political speeches and the diplomatic notes and the newspaper editorials that filled the decades leading up to 1914 and again to 1939, there was one hard, cold reason for the fight. Iron ore. Sidney Gilchrist Thomas died young. He was only 34 years old when he died in Paris on February 1, 1885, has lungs destroyed by years of work in industrial laboratories. He never saw what his invention would eventually do. He never saw the trenches of the Somme. He never saw the panzers rolling across the fields where his ore had been dug. He is buried in a small cemetery in Paris, and almost nobody visits. Now the story crosses an ocean, and it does something almost unbelievable. The year is 1929. On the eastern side of the Ural Mountains, on a barren steppe where nothing existed but a small mining outpost and an iron-rich hill called Magnetic Mountain, the Soviet government under Joseph Stalin began building a city. The city was called Magnitogorsk. It was designed for one purpose, to pour out steel, millions of tons of it. To be the industrial spine of the first Soviet 5-year plan, peasants were shipped in by the tens of thousands from villages across the Soviet Union. Prison labor was used. People lived in tents through winters that dropped to 40 below zero. Hundreds died of exposure, of hunger, of accidents. And there was a problem. The Soviet Union in 1929 had almost no engineers who knew how to build a modern integrated steel mill. So they hired Americans. The contract went to a Cleveland engineering firm called Arthur G. McKee and Company. McKee sent teams of American engineers and draftsmen to the Ural steppe in 1930. They brought blueprints, they brought slide rules, they brought experience from working on American mills, and the plant they designed for Stalin was based, in large part, on the layout of United States Steel's massive Gary Works in Gary, Indiana. Blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, coke ovens, all of it modeled on what American capitalism had built along the shore of Lake Michigan. Some of the American engineers stayed for years. They lived in barracks. They worked in temperatures that froze the ink in their pens. They were paid partly in dollars and partly in rubles that were worth nothing outside the Soviet Union. A few of them died there. A few of them, later, when they returned home during the Great Depression, told stories that nobody in America wanted to hear. The Soviets learned, fast. By 1932, the first blast furnace at Magnitogorsk was firing. By 1937, the plant was one of the largest steel producers in the world. And the steel that came out of those American-designed furnaces would eventually be forged and welded and bolted into a machine that would kill more German soldiers than any other weapon in history. The T-34 tank, over 80,000 of them would be built during the war, made largely from Magnitogorsk steel, crewed by young Soviet men who had never heard of Arthur G. McKee, or the city of Cleveland, rolling across the summer fields near a place called Kursk in July of 1943, ready to break the back of the German army in the greatest tank battle in human history. American engineers had built the furnaces that made the steel that killed Hitler's panzers, and nobody in Moscow, and nobody in Cleveland, and nobody in Washington seemed to fully understand what had just happened. But that is not even the strangest part of this decade. Because in the same years that American engineers were teaching the Soviets how to pour steel, the German firm Krupp had been quietly teaching the Japanese. Japan had built its first modern integrated steel mill in 1901. It was called the Iwata Works, on the northern coast of the island of Kyushu. It had been built with substantial technical assistance from German engineers, including men trained at Krupp. Over the following decades, Japanese metallurgy grew up in the shadow of German expertise. Krupp designs, Krupp patents, Krupp know-how. Japanese engineering students traveled to Essen to study under German masters. German technicians traveled to Kyushu to supervise Japanese apprentices. The same technology, born in a London workshop in 1855, was now arming 3 of the 4 largest militaries on Earth, all of whom were about to try to kill each other. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The old Krupp patriarch, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, had been suspicious of the Nazis for years. He had thought Hitler was a vulgar rabble-rouser, but in the early 1930s, the banker Hjalmar Schacht, a shrewd financial operator who would later serve as Hitler's Minister of Economics, convinced the Krupp family to change their minds. Schacht argued that Hitler would destroy the labor unions, that Hitler would rearm Germany, that Hitler would make the arms industry rich again. Gustav Krupp came around, and his eldest son came around faster. Alfred Krupp von Bohlen-Halterbach was born on the 13th of August 1907 in Essen. He was 26 years old when Hitler took power. He was 32 when the German army crossed the Polish border in September 1939. He was tall and dark and reserved, an engineer by training and by all accounts a cold man. In 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor, Alfred Krupp joined the SS. He would eventually hold the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain in the SS. In 1937, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in the Nazi state, founded a massive state-owned steel and armaments combine called the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. It would grow to rival Krupp itself in size. Between them, Krupp and the Reichswerke controlled the industrial spine of the coming war. Now, listen carefully, because this is the part that decides everything. In 1943, the peak year of Hitler's war economy, Germany produced 30.5 million tons of steel. It was a staggering figure. It was more than any European country had ever produced. It was made possible by Krupp, by the Reichswerk, by the annexed steel plants in the Saar, and in occupied France, and in occupied Belgium, and in the mines of Lorraine that Sidney Gilchrist Thomas had unlocked 65 years earlier. In the same year, the Soviet Union produced 8.5 million tons. Great Britain produced 13.2 million tons. Japan produced 6.3 million tons, and the United States of America produced 80.6 million tons of steel. Read those numbers again. Germany 30, the Soviet Union 8, Britain 13, Japan 6, America 80. The United States alone produced more steel in 1943 than every other major combatant in the war combined. It was not close, it was not even a fair comparison. It was a chasm. It was the industrial equivalent of a fully grown man in a fistfight with a 9-year-old boy. And one man in the Japanese Imperial Navy had understood exactly what those numbers meant. He had understood it years before Pearl Harbor. His name was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was born in 1884 in a small town called Nagaoka, the son of a former samurai. He was 57 years old on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the aircraft of his first air fleet came screaming out of the Hawaiian sunrise and dropped their bombs on the American Pacific Fleet at anchor. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had lived in America. He had traveled by train across the vast American interior, from Boston to Detroit to Chicago. Later, from 1926 to 1928, he had served as the Japanese naval attaché in Washington. He had seen the Texas oil fields, endless fields of derricks, pumping black gold 24 hours a day. He had seen the Pittsburgh steel mills, glowing orange against the night sky, running around the clock. He had seen the endless assembly lines of Detroit turning out automobiles by the thousands. He had gone home to Japan and tried to tell his own government the truth. The truth was that a war with the United States could not be won. Not by Japan, not with the industrial base Japan possessed. The Americans could build ships faster than the Japanese could sink them. The Americans could build airplanes faster than Japanese pilots could shoot them down. The Americans could pour out steel at 15 times the rate of the entire Japanese empire. In a conversation with the Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in the autumn of 1940, Yamamoto is reported to have said something that has echoed through history ever since. For the first 6 months of a war with the United States, I will run wild. I will win victory after victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. 6 months. He gave his own country 6 months. The empire he served did not listen. They believed spirit and discipline could overcome factories. They believed the American people were soft and would sue for peace after a few hard blows. They believed racial superiority would make up for material weakness. They ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto planned it because he was a serving officer and it was his duty. He struck the blow he had told them would not, in the end, be enough, and on the other side of the Pacific, an industrial machine that had been quietly building since Andrew Carnegie's day was about to roar to life. American steel, American oil, American shipyards, American factories, all of it built at the foundation on a mechanical principle discovered in a London workshop in 1855. Blow air through molten iron. Let the chemistry do the work. Steel comes out the other side. And now, in the winter of 1941, the world was about to find out what happened when a country with 80 million tons of steel per year went to war against a country with 6. On the morning of December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, an industrialist named Henry John Kaiser walked into a meeting in Washington, D.C. with a proposal that most of the men in the room thought was impossible. Kaiser was 59 years old. He was heavy-set, red-faced, balding, and impatient. He had grown up poor in upstate New York, the son of German immigrants. He had left school at 13 to work in a dry goods store. He had never built a ship in his life. He had made his money pouring concrete. Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, the Bay Bridge across San Francisco Bay. He was a construction man. Not a shipbuilder. Traditional shipbuilders in Newport News and Bath and Philadelphia looked down on him. They said he did not understand ship construction. They said he was a self-promoter. They said what he was proposing was ridiculous. What he was proposing was this: He would build cargo ships the way Henry Ford built automobiles. He would prefabricate the pieces at inland factories all across the American Midwest. He would ship them by rail to the coast. He would weld them together instead of riveting them, cutting the assembly time in half. And he would launch them in weeks, not years. Roosevelt agreed. The country was at war. There was no time for tradition. By 1943, Henry Kaiser's 7 shipyard wards were pouring out vessels at a rate that no one on Earth had ever seen before. Not the British, not the Germans, not the Japanese. At the beginning of 1942, it had taken roughly 250 days to build a single Liberty ship. By the end of 1943, that number had fallen to less than 50 days. In the most efficient Kaiser yards, a Liberty ship could be launched in under 30 days from the moment its keel was laid. One of them, the Robert E. Peary, launched from the Kaiser shipyard at Richmond, California in November 1942, was built in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. 4 days. From bare keel plate to a fully assembled ocean-going cargo ship, it was done as a publicity stunt to show what American industry was capable of. Newsreel cameras filmed every hour of construction. Radio broadcasts announce each new milestone to listeners across the country, but even in the ordinary rhythm of the yards, ships were being launched at a pace that read like something out of a fever dream. By the end of the war, American shipyards had built 2,710 Liberty ships. Kaiser's 7 yards alone had produced 821 of them, plus 219 Victory ships, plus tankers, plus escort carriers, plus troop transports, plus landing craft. All told, Kaiser's yards produced roughly 1,550 vessels for the American war effort. One family of shipyards, one man's business. Every one of those ships was made of steel. Steel from Pittsburgh, steel from Gary, steel from Bethlehem, steel from Youngstown, steel from 100 blast furnaces stretching from the shores of Lake Erie to the coalfields of West Virginia. Steel that had been dreamed into existence 87 years earlier by a self-taught inventor in a London workshop. The numbers of the war become almost unreadable when you stack them up. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built roughly 88,000 tanks. It built 354,000 military aircraft. It built 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 64,000 landing craft, 2 million military trucks, and it did all of it while feeding, clothing, and equipping not only its own 12 million service members, but a huge fraction of the Soviet, British, and Chinese war efforts as well. American Lend-Lease shipments sent to the Soviet Union alone included over 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, and enough food to feed the entire Red Army for years. Germany, in the same period, built 1,347 Tiger I heavy tanks. It built about 6,000 Panthers. These were, by any technical measure, the finest tanks in the world. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 yards. A Panther could hold its own against anything the Allies fielded. German engineering was not the problem. The problem was that for every Tiger the Germans built, the Americans built more than 35 Shermans. 49,234 of them by the end of the war, plus tens of thousands more from British and Canadian production. When a Sherman crew met a Tiger in a Normandy hedgerow, the Sherman crew had bad odds in that individual fight. Ask any American tanker who fought in Europe. The Sherman was outgunned. The Sherman was under-armored. The Sherman could not stand toe-to-toe with a Tiger and expect to win. But behind the Sherman, there were another 35 tanks coming up the road. Behind the Tiger, there were often none at all. You cannot out-engineer arithmetic, and you cannot pour steel you do not have, which brings us back to the Ruhr Valley and to the night of March 5, 1943, where this story began. The man who ordered the bombing was named Arthur Travers Harris. He was 51 years old. He was the commander-in-chief of Royal Air Force Bomber Command. His nickname among his own air crews was Butcher Harris, later shortened simply to Butch. He believed, with a conviction that never wavered, that Germany could be broken from the air. That if you burned down enough of the German industrial cities, the war would end. He was a difficult man. He argued with his superiors. He held long grudges. He sent boys to die by the thousand and slept through the night without difficulty. The Battle of the Ruhr ran from March 5th to July 31st, 1943, 5 months. 43 major raids on 39 separate nights. Around 1,000 British aircraft lost, 6,000 young Royal Air Force airmen killed in action, boys from Manchester and Toronto and Melbourne and Cape Town, going down in flames over Essen, Duisburg, Dortmund, Bochum. The Krupp works in Essen was hit again and again and again. The first raid on the night of March 5th put 160 acres of the complex out of action. 53 separate buildings inside the Krupp grounds took direct hits. Reconnaissance photographs the next day showed workshops flattened, roofs peeled back, molten steel congealed in the streets. Follow-up raids came on March 12th, on April 3rd, on April 30th, on May 27th, on June 12th. Each raid killed civilians. Each raid consumed British aircrew. Each raid was met with claims from London that this time, the German war machine had been dealt a mortal blow. But here is the thing they did not know back in London when they looked at those photographs. Just to the south of Essen, in an area of open farmland near the town of Velbert, the Germans had built something that looked from 10,000 feet in the air, exactly like the Krupp steelworks. Fake buildings made of wood and canvas, fake smokestacks, fake blast furnace shapes, electric lights that could be switched on at night to mimic the glow of active furnaces. It was called the Kruppsche Nachtscheinanlage, the Krupp night decoy installation. When British bombers flew over the Ruhr at night, trying to spot the real Krupp complex through the industrial smog, they sometimes bombed the decoy instead. Tons of high explosive rained down on empty fields, lit up with electric lamps. The Germans would repair the fake buildings the next day and light them up again for the next raid. British aircrew came home believing they had struck a mortal blow to German industry. In reality, they had cratered a farm. And the real Krupp works, though badly hit, kept producing, not at full capacity. Nothing produced at full capacity under that kind of bombing. But it produced. Repairs were made. Production was dispersed. Workshops were moved underground where possible. Slave labor was brought in from the concentration camps to replace the German workers who had been killed or drafted. Because that is the other truth about how German industry kept running. Alfred Krupp requested slave labor from the SS. He signed detailed contracts specifying the terms. His firm operated its own concentration camp adjacent to the Krupp works in Essen, called Humboldtstrasse. Prisoners from Auschwitz were shipped by rail to work in his factories. Jewish women, Russian prisoners of war, political prisoners from every country in occupied Europe. They died at their machines. They were beaten by his guards. They were worked to skeletons on rations that would not have kept a house cat alive. At one Krupp facility in Essen alone, 520 Jewish women from Hungary were made to work through the winter of 1944 and 1945 in unheated barracks, in clothing that was little more than rags, on rations of watery soup and mouldy bread. Many died. The survivors were force-marched east in the final weeks of the war so that Allied troops would not find them alive to bear witness. And Alfred Krupp knew all of it. He walked those factory floors. He read the production reports. He signed the paperwork. In post-war testimony, he would claim he had not known the details. The evidence, when it was gathered, showed that he had known everything. So what actually broke the German steel industry in the end? It was not the bombing. Not really, not on its own. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, a cold and brilliant architect who had reorganized the entire German war economy, managed to keep German war production rising until the summer 1944, despite everything the Royal Air Force and the American 8th Air Force could throw at him. Tank production went up, aircraft production went up, artillery production went up. The bombing on its own was not enough. What broke Germany was a combination of four things arriving at almost the same time. First, the loss of Lorraine. In September 1944, American forces retook the iron ore basin along the French-German border, the same basin that Sidney Gilchrist Thomas unlocked in 1878. Germany lost roughly a quarter of its iron ore supply overnight. Second, the loss of Silesia. In January and February of 1945, the Soviet Red Army overran the industrial region of Upper Silesia in what is now southern Poland. Germany lost most of the rest of its raw material base. Third, the American and British bombing campaign shifted its focus to German transportation. marshalling yards, bridges, canals, railway junctions. The transportation plan, they called it. It choked off the movement of coke from the Ruhr to the steel mills. You cannot make steel without coke, and you cannot move coke on burned railway lines. Fleets of American B-17s and B-24s hit rail yards day after day, blowing tracks into twisted spaghetti, sending locomotives tumbling into craters. Fourth, the constant bombing and forced dispersal of German factories had, over time, cut productivity by 30 to 40%, even where the buildings still stood. Workers exhausted from air raid nights could not keep up the pace. Skilled craftsmen died or were drafted. Machined tools that broke down could not be replaced quickly. The whole system slowly began to grind down. The furnaces went cold, the rolling mills stopped. The Krupp locomotive works, which had been hit in the March 12th raid of 1943, never resumed locomotive production for the entire rest of the war. By April 1945, American tanks were rolling into Essen itself. British and American infantry walked through the shattered ruins of the Krupp complex. Whole streets that had once been the heart of German heavy industry were reduced to broken chimneys and jagged walls. The weapons forge of the Reich was silent. On the 15th of April 1945, Alfred Krupp was arrested by American troops in his family home, Villa Hügel, on the outskirts of Essen. He did not resist. American officers found him in his study, dressed in a suit, calm, polite, as if he had been expecting them for days. He was 37 years old. He was put on trial at Nuremberg in 1947 and 1948 in what became known as the Krupp trial. The charges included the plunder of occupied territories and the use of slave labor. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified. Documents were entered. Photographs were introduced. On the 31st of July 1948, Alfred Krupp was convicted, sentenced to 12 years in prison. All of his personal property was ordered forfeited to the Allied occupation authorities. He served 3 years. In January 1951, the American High Commissioner for Germany, a lawyer named John J. McCloy, issued a clemency order. Krupp was released from Landsberg prison. His property was returned to him. His companies were handed back. The reasoning, though never stated quite this bluntly in the public documents, was simple. The Cold War had started. West Germany was now an ally. The Americans needed German industry rebuilt, and they needed men like Alfred Krupp running it. The convicted war criminal became, almost overnight, an asset in the fight against the Soviet Union. The convicted war criminal walked out of prison in 1951 and rebuilt his empire. Within a decade, Krupp was the 12th largest corporation in the world. Alfred Krupp died at Villa Hügel on the 30th of July 1967 at the age of 59. When his funeral was held a few days later, 125,000 Krupp workers across West Germany stopped their machines at the exact moment his coffin was carried from the great hall of the villa. They stood in silence to mourn a man who had used their fathers and grandfathers as slave labor. That is the world the steel built. The Bessemer process itself, the invention that had started all of it, lingered on for a few more decades and then quietly died. The open hearth furnace, developed in the 1860s by the German engineer William Siemens and the French engineer Pierre Martin working independently, took over most of the industrial capacity. Later, the basic oxygen furnace made even the open hearth obsolete. Larger batches, better quality control, better ability to recycle scrap. The last operating Bessemer converter in the United States went cold in the 1960s. The last operating Bessemer converter in the United Kingdom was shut down in 1974 at the British Steel Corporation works in Workington. That final converter now sits under glass at the Kellamar Island Museum in Sheffield, the same city where Henry Bessemer had built his first commercial steel plant 115 years earlier. A machine that helped shape the modern world, cold and silent, behind a rope line, watched by tourists and school children who mostly do not understand what they are looking at. Henry Bessemer himself lived to see the beginning of what his invention had unleashed, though not the worst of it. He was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1879, becoming Sir Henry Bessemer, though he always insisted the knighthood was late recognition of that stamp invention the government had stolen from him half a century earlier. He held over 100 patents. He built a solar furnace. He designed a ship with a passenger cabin mounted on gimbals so travelers would not get seasick, though the ship itself was a commercial failure. He built an astronomical observatory at his home in London and ground his own telescope lenses. He never stopped working. He died at his home in Denmark Hill, London, on the 15th of March, 1898, at the age of 85. He was buried at West Norwood Cemetery. His obituaries filled the front pages of every major newspaper in the industrial world. In his autobiography, published after his death, he wrote about his hopes for what steel would do for humanity. He believed that cheap steel would make travel easier, would make cities safer, would build the infrastructure of a peaceful and prosperous age. He used the phrase Golden Age. He truly believed it. 47 years after his death, the Golden Age had produced this. Between the beginning of the First World War in 1914 and the end of the Second World War in 1945, between 70 and 85 million human beings died in industrial warfare. Steel dreadnoughts sinking with their crews trapped inside, going down in the cold Atlantic with the pipes still whistling. Steel tanks rolling over farm villages in France and Russia and Ukraine, crushing children as they fled. Steel artillery shells falling on cities from London to Dresden to Tokyo, steel rails carrying human beings in sealed cattle cars to death camps whose names we now teach to school children. Steel barbed wire strung across 100 European fields, catching men who died screaming on the wire while machine guns finished them from the trenches. The converter that Henry Bessemer had first fired in a burning workshop in the summer of 1855 had, in the end, done exactly what he said it would do. It had physically rebuilt the modern world. He had just not understood, or had not allowed himself to understand, what the modern world would choose to do with all that cheap steel. There is a moment in every technology's life when its inventor has to look at what has been done with it. Bessemer did not live long enough to see the Krupp gun batteries on the Somme, or the Tiger tanks at Kursk, or the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. He was spared that. Whether that was a mercy is not for us to say. If you are the son or grandson of a man who fought in that war, take a moment tonight and think about him. Think about the ship that carried him across the ocean. Think about the rifle he held. Think about the tank he crewed, or the tank that saved him from a German gun, or the transport that flew him home when the fighting was done. Every rivet, every plate, every shell casing, every helmet, every dog tag, all of it began as pig iron poured into a converter somewhere in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Indiana. All of it began with a chemical reaction that a self-taught Englishman had figured out 90 years earlier by pure trial and error. Your father, or your grandfather, or your uncle came home because of that. Millions of other men's fathers and grandfathers and uncles did not, because the men on the other side of the fight had the same technology and used it against them. That is not a comfortable thought. History rarely is. But the story does not really end with Bessemer, or with Alfred Krupp, or with Henry Kaiser, or with any of the men in this story. It ends with a question, and the question is this. Every generation has a technology like the Bessemer converter. Something that seems, at the moment of its birth, like it will make the world richer and safer and freer. Something whose inventors truly believe they are giving humanity a gift, and then, decades later, when the historians look back, that same technology is somehow at the center of the century's worst violence. We have technologies like that being born right now, in the laboratories in California, in factories in Shenzhen, in research parks in Bangalore. Their inventors believe, as Bessemer did, that they are ushering in a golden age. Perhaps they are. Or perhaps, somewhere in the middle of the 22nd century, a historian will sit down to explain how the war of that time was decided. And the answer will trace back, through decades of quiet development, to a workshop we can already see today, to an invention whose real consequences none of us, and none of its makers, can yet imagine. Henry Bessemer poured molten iron into a converter in the summer of 1855, and the world we live in, for better and for worse, has been standing on that pour ever since. If this story taught you something, or made you see the 20th century in a way you hadn't before, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which part stayed with you the longest. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the hidden inventions and forgotten men who quietly shaped the world your family lived through, give the video a like so we know to keep making them. Thank you for watching, and thank you in particular to every one of you who served and to every one of you whose family did.